That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. Welcome to a special edition of the Great Old Ones Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Nate, lost in time and space.
And I am Innkeeper Vase Odin from the Twisted Tentacle Inn.
And today we're going to be joined by a very special guest, co-founder of Arc Dream Publishing, Shane Ivey. Shane, welcome to the cast.
Hi, thank you very much. It's fun to be here.
Great. Well, Shane, why don't you go ahead and give a quick introduction for those who may not know who you are and what you do at Arc Dream Publishing?
Sure. So Arc Dream is a creative partnership between me and Dennis Detwiller. We're most well known for Delta Green, which is a role playing game and fiction line of Cthulhu mythos horror in the modern day that we've been writing for and publishing for many years. It's won lots of awards and gotten lots of acclaim, and it's really satisfying and great fun to create. I also published the Unspeakable Oath, which is our very irregular Cthulhu gaming, mainly RPG magazine that is ostensibly quarterly, but if I get out one issue a year these days, it feels like an accomplishment.
Ostensibly being key there.
Yeah. I think that in the early days, Pagan Publishing was the original publisher of the Oath, managed to put out 4 issues in a single year. I think once in 1992, maybe, and that was about it. But we've also we're publishing Wrestlenomicon, which is it's a far less bleak take on Cthulhu stuff than we usually do, which is a card game about the great old ones fighting and brawling over the end of the world. And so the initial release of that is a box set that includes decks for Cthulhu and Hastur, and that'll be coming out later this year. We're putting the final touches on development and art direction and everything on that this month. And
it seems to be very tongue. Yeah, it seems to be very tongue in cheek. It's it's great.
Yeah, definitely. The whole game basically came about because for whatever reason Dennis and I just started getting punchy many years ago and started trading goofy puns about Cthulhu and Hastur hitting each other. So it has attack cards, attack cards like the Relay Shuffle and Casilda's Thong.
Yeah, Casilda's Thong is hilarious.
It's very punny and deliberately kind of goofy and dumb, and but it's fun, and the art is hilarious. And Rob Hainso and his team at Fire Opal Games developed the rules and the gameplay for it. So it's been a really fun process to see that come together after all these years.
Yeah, that's great. So I wanted to ask you, Shane, what was the genesis of Arc Dream Publishing? How did you and Dennis come to be partners, and what was the separation ultimately from Pagan Publishing?
We never really had a formal separation from Pagan Publishing. I'd worked as a contractor off and on for Pagan, occasionally doing like proofreading and a little bit of freelance writing and website development and design back in the 90s for them, and was just basically a giant fan. And Dennis was art director for Pagan, but in the early 2000s, John Tynes, who was the founder of Pagan and kind of its principal director, he kind of got burned out on role-playing games after spending 10 or 12 years on them full time, and he started working in other fields and basically put his role in Pagan Publishing on hiatus. And so Pagan's workflow, Scott Glancy took over managing everything, but even so, Pagan's production flow kind of started to slow, and at the same time, they had developed. John had worked with Dennis. Dennis was the principal designer, and worked with Greg Stolze on a role playing game called Godlike, which is a World War II game about superpowered commandos in the war, and they'd published originally that was going to be like Pagan Publishing's first official full-fledged standalone role-playing game, and but they worked out a deal with a new company, Hawthorne Hobgoblin, that evolved into a lot of different companies over the years to publish Godlike. So over the next year or two, they published Godlike, and they published the first book for it. But production on that, even then, production on it was was really kind of slow, and Dennis started getting increasingly frustrated. And so at the time, then I was working as a magazine editor and had worked in, newspapers and had a publishing background already even then. So we basically started putting our heads together and said, well, why don't we just start our own thing, and do it ourselves? We can kind of combine our skill sets and get it done. And that's how it began.
So did Dennis and you have the rights to publish stuff under the Delta Green banner, or did you have to acquire that somehow?
With Delta Green, it was a while before we started publishing for Delta Green. We started with Godlike, and we took over the Godlike line from Hobgoblin in 2002, I think, or 2003, and then in 2007, if I'm remembering right, we worked out a deal with Pagan and with John to where Arc Dream would take point on development of a new Delta Green hardback book that collected a bunch of old material and then added some new material, and Pagan Publishing would be the publisher of it. But we set up this deal basically where we would sell and publish the hardback edition, and then they would sell a retail edition in the paperback, and we'd sort of divvy everything up, and that worked out great for everybody. So we did that with 2 different books over the next few years, and then a couple of years after that, we worked out a deal with the Delta Green Partnership, which is the entity that owns the Delta Green intellectual property, for Arc Dream to develop new material and develop a standalone role-playing game and a line of books to go with it.
So is Delta Green in its new iteration a standalone game separate from Call of Cthulhu, or is it still compatible with the Call of Cthulhu game?
Both. It's a standalone game, but it's eminently compatible. Our first design principle when we started putting together what's this game going to look like, well, our first design principle was we wanted it to be its own thing. We didn't want it to be dependent on another company's work, right? Or another company's publishing policies, I should say, for it to come out. We wanted it to be kind of independent, but at the same time, we wanted it to be easily compatible with everything we'd already done for Delta Green over the past however many years it had been, 20 years or something by that time. And so the rules, if you look at the rules from Delta Green and you look at the rules especially from Call of Cthulhu 6th edition, they're so similar that there's not a lot of daylight between them. It's not hard for people to pick it up and just run with it. We have a few innovations in the sanity rules especially, and there are a few things here and there that work differently or that we've added that have a learning curve, but it's a learning curve you can measure in seconds, not even in minutes. And so again, it's kind of both. It's very, very compatible. The only thing that would separate it from 7th edition really is 7th edition they changed the stats all to percentile scores, right? So if you can multiply by 5, then you're good.
Yep. Well, some of our listeners might not be familiar with what Delta Green is. So, Shane, why don't you give us a quick synopsis of what Delta Green is and how it ties into the Cthulhu mythos?
Sure, Delta Green. So it's a modern day game, and it's about investigators, generally who are professional investigators or experts who work with them, who discover, stumble into, realize there are incredibly dangerous, toxic horrors in the world that threaten sanity and survival and lives, and they work together to investigate those and confront them and save other people from having to encounter them and suffer from them. So gameplay typically is it typically starts off with a couple of the players playing actual agents, like law enforcement officers, FBI agents or something like that, and a couple of others playing sort of civilian experts, doctors or anthropologists or what have you, and so in theory your characters have a great deal of expertise when they begin investigating and access to a lot of resources potentially, but it very quickly becomes apparent that all of those things are extraordinarily limited, and so gameplay is this constant has this constant tension between trying to kind of use what you have and what's available to you, and recognizing the risks of exposure that come with using those resources, because exposure is the thing that's most destructive in what the agents do.
It's interesting that you guys chose a modern setting. I feel like players might be a little overconfident because of available technologies and all that when combating great old ones and the mythos. What kind of challenges did you guys have when deciding to go with a modern setting, or was that something deliberate to give people overconfidence?
Oh yeah, no, I mean that's never been a problem for us. The big challenge in Delta Green, one of the big challenges for agents is reducing the spread of these unnatural threats that are so dangerous and to life and limb and sanity. And the big thing that you can bring to the table in a modern game is communications. We live in the communication age. You can communicate instantly. It's in all kind of data, and that's far more useful for spreading the things that you're trying to keep secret than it is for keeping those things secret to begin with. So all of the what we kind of enjoy doing with Delta Green when we were developing the new game, especially, we focused on this a lot, is focusing on the ways in which all of these tools and all of these technologies and techniques that you can bring to bear are in their own right sources of horror and sources of risk for your characters.
Yeah, in your most recent release, Control Group, the first operation sees the investigators going into space. I wanted to kind of touch on Control Group as a broad project. What was the catalyst for that project, and did you feel the game needed a product like Control Group? Had fans been asking for this type of product, or was it something that you as a publisher felt that Delta Green needed a project like this?
Yeah, so Control Group first came about the idea for it came about, oh gosh, I think 2010 was when Greg Stolze and I first started batting the ideas around for it. And originally, Greg Stolze was one of the key developers of the mechanics of Delta Green, the role-playing game, and the mechanical innovations that are in it. And so he originally had envisioned the campaign as a series of scenarios that would each kind of iteratively teach a portion of the key rules concepts. So one of the adventures was going to focus primarily on just using skills in different ways. Another one's going to focus a lot on combat. Another one focus heavily on bonds and sanity. And that kind of fell away over time as we were developing the game, because of course we were developing the game itself alongside his first drafts of the scenarios of the campaign. It very quickly became clear that purpose was really kind of redundant, because the rules of the game are just not that hard. It's not that tough to teach people, and so what wound up happening is the initial drafts of the adventures devoted more time to telling the game master what not to use out of the rules in order to keep the focus on these teaching tools than they did on actually making the scenarios suspenseful and terrifying. And so so it sort of changed shape and changed focus over time, and evolved into what we have now, which is a series of adventures, like 3 scenarios that are built to feature characters who are not part of Delta Green. They're not part of the conspiracy, the organization, but they're exposed to those threats, and then they can be those who survive can be recruited potentially by the group, and and then you can kind of see as players, the players can decide how they respond to the indoctrination, for lack of a better word, of Delta Green saying these threats are so dangerous that we have to go through all these things to keep them secret. And then the 4th adventure is one where you can bring the characters together as an actual Delta Green team, and so it became a way to kind of introduce characters to the program, and by extension, it works very well for introducing new players to the program, to Delta Green as well.
You in these scenarios, you mentioned that most of the agents start out as non-agents. They don't know anything about Delta Green or its existence, so they're just regular people. And it reminded me of the bonded mechanic that you guys created for this game, which is a really interesting mechanic. What brought that about, and what is its purpose for those who don't know about the game?
What the purpose of the bonds rules?
The bonds
Sure.
rules. Yep.
The fundamental purpose of them is to help establish and make really explicit the individual characters' ties to the real world, so to speak, to the world outside of Delta Green. When we're playing Delta Green scenarios, they tend to be very isolated. They're far from the characters' homes. The characters are doing everything in their power to keep what happens there, to sort of tie it up in a bow and keep it from being exposed, and then they go home and everything's back to normal. And so the first thing that I wanted to do with bonds was establish what normal means, and what these characters are protecting, and the price that they pay for the things they do to protect those things. So characters are all the time, agents in Delta Green are all the time confronting things that sap their sanity, and and potentially are very physically risky and damaging. And those threats are ways that can damage your bonds, because you're going home paying the psychological price of what you've been doing. And it was, and that kind of developed. Those rules developed in consultation with PTSD counselors and veterans counselors, and it was a very deliberate thing that for me especially, it was really important for me to make sure that the new version of Delta Green recognized that we, especially here in the U.S., we have millions and millions of people now that over the last 15 years or more we've put through the ringer and have been through terrible, terrible traumas and dangers, and having to come home and live with that. And it didn't seem fathomable to me that we would do a role playing game about people going away from home and facing terrible traumas and dangers, and not feature the cost of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and adds kind of an adult theme to the game. It's interesting how a horror game can either be pulpy or almost comedic, but then this kind of adds this adultness to it, and the game itself just seems tailored to a more adult audience for sure. One of the first lines in I think it's the agent's handbook is "I fucked up," which is, I thought that was awesome. I'm like, okay, that totally sets the tone. Definitely.
Right. Yeah. I mean, thematically, Delta Green, as its own thing, is about human failure. It's not a power fantasy. It's about the limitations of humanity and the ways in which humanity fails and deteriorates and degenerates as it's put to the test. And so the big hero moments for agents in Delta Green is when they overcome all of the odds and stand up despite all of that. And that's the most rewarding things you can see in a Delta Green game, and that's what makes them so rewarding. So the rules from top to bottom, that's kind of where they're oriented. And so yeah, it was a really deliberate choice on our part early on that we had a particular mode of play in mind and a particular set of themes in mind and a particular kind of experience that we wanted it to evoke.
Shane, you had mentioned earlier about cleaning up the sanity system from Call of Cthulhu 6th edition going into Delta Green. Can you quickly touch on what you wanted to improve from the previous sanity system going into Delta Green, and what aspects of it did you not like and want to improve?
Well, so cleaning up and trying to improve it is kind of overstating it a little bit. There were some things that we wanted to focus on specifically that the existing rules didn't really focus on very closely. And we wanted to kind of modernize it to some extent as well. The Call of Cthulhu Sanity rules, I mean, they first came out in 1980, 81. I think it was 81. And it was very much kind of, it was built to recreate seeing Lovecraft's protagonists faint away in horror and go crazy and develop weird, funny phobias and things. And so because this was a modern game, and because we knew there were going to be so many readers and players who have direct experience of trauma, of psychological trauma, and trying to recover from it, we wanted to take that seriously and make it feel less like a lark and more like your agents are dealing with something that we can kind of recognize and respect. And so the mechanics of it, we, thanks to the Open Gaming License and Wizards of the Coast publishing the core sanity rules under the OGL, we were able to just use wholesale. It's based on your power score, and it's a percentile scale, and you roll percentiles under the score in order to succeed. And as your sanity goes lower, your chance of success becomes lower and lower, and it sort of spirals out of control. And all of that we very much wanted to keep. So where we kind of veered away into our own territory was in the shape that long-term mental disorders take and how they come about. So they come about in Delta Green over time. Usually it's pretty gradual, but you don't pick up a new phobia in the middle of a game after seeing a trauma or whatever. You if your sanity starts to dip too low, then you basically make a note of that, and between adventures, when you deal with what's your character going through at home and what is your private life looking like, then you start dealing with the repercussions, and that's when these long-term things might emerge. And then the types of disorders as well, we keyed very deliberately to real world research. So getting badly traumatized by violence is likely to have different effects on your character than getting badly traumatized by seeing some impossible magical thing happen.
Yeah, and you can see the gradual decline or the beginnings and the ends of it on the two covers of the core rules of the game, the Agent's Handbook and the Handler's. Is it the Handler's Guide or Handler's
Yeah.
Handbook? Yeah, yeah, Handler's Guide. Where the guy in the Agent's Handbook, it's just at first when I saw that cover, I'm like, this is weird. Just some sweaty guy that looks paranoid. But then when you look at the other cover, it's the same guy, but he's been completely changed and obviously gone insane by the book he was holding in the other cover. The art in the game is really, it really tells the story of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the art in Control Group, that is one of the creepiest pieces of art I've seen.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah.
Was that Dennis's doing? Because that is immensely creepy.
What are we talking about?
The front cover art.
Oh
for
yeah,
Control
yeah.
Group.
That was that's Dennis Detwiller does all of the illustrations and cover art for the Delta Green role playing game line. And it's uniformly
incredible.
fantastic work. So yeah, there's one of the scenarios deals with the CDC confronting an outbreak of this really lethal disease in a small town in Arizona. So yeah, the front cover shows somebody in a like a biohazard
suit,
hazmat suit in an apartment complex or something. And yeah, you've got the poor, sad little teddy bear.
Covered with like a bloody handprint.
Right.
Yeah, it's so evocative. Delta Green is so fascinating to me, especially because it has a long history, even in its own game sense terms too, because it starts all the way back in 1920s and goes all the way forward with the Delta Green license, and with such a rich and interesting backstory that Delta Green has, I feel like it can feel difficult for new players to get invested into this game without feeling overwhelmed. What were some of the key aspects of Delta Green that you wanted to really drive home for players in Control Group?
Well, I think that first and foremost to keep the focus tight. This is especially important for the handler, right, the game master who's running the game, because it's we hear one thing we hear pretty frequently from gamers is that they feel like they're for handlers is they look at the material and they get really excited and enthusiastic, which is of course fabulous to hear. It's wonderful, but then they see we put so much into the handler's guide and they're like, I don't even know where to start. How do what do I do with all of this? But if you look at the scenarios we've published, we've got a couple, 2 or 3 dozen of them out and about nowadays. They have a really specific focus. There's a threat, right? There's a location that you're dealing with, and that's the biggest thing to remember is don't I want people to make sure that they realize that you don't have to embrace all the tools in the toolbox or use every tool in the toolbox simultaneously, right? You use the tool that fits your need, and with the handler's guide is 368 pages of tools on every single page. So pick a page, right, and make your game about that, about that moment, and then you can kind of develop it over time as you go. If it's a success and your players want, if they dig it and the game thrives, then you can start exploring the background and make it deeper and deeper. But even there, you're only likely to explore a sliver of the background at in any one campaign. So yeah, keep the focus narrow, and make the horror, the kind of apocalyptic terrors that agents confront. They work best at the table when they're very personal and when they're small. Seeing something terrifying happen to a small family that your agents have interviewed and have gotten to know is has way more impact than seeing something terrifying happen to 1,000 people, right? Because it's personal and because you can empathize with the individuals. So yeah, keep the focus tight and pick your favorite, your single favorite thing that you want to make your game about, and play with that, and then build on that with your next favorite thing.
Well, speaking of favorites, what's your favorite operation in Control Group? And you have to be honest now.
Oh, I think it's probably going to be Sick Again out of the four. The scenarios, there's Night Visions is set in Afghanistan in the war, and then Sick Again is set in Black Sat is set in it's like this NASA mission that goes really bad, and there's a Wormwood Arena is the final scenario. It's this kind of mini campaign that has a Delta Green team trying to investigate, potentially infiltrate this cult that looks more and more dangerous the more you look at it. And then Sick Again is just a CDC assignment in a town, and but I wound up doing as Greg Stoltze was the initial author on all of those. I wound up doing a lot of research and writing to finalize them and finish them, especially Sick Again. The more I kind of researched and wrote about the details, of outbreaks of this kind and the kinds of diseases that that CDC people work with, and how the procedures, like the mechanics of how that kind of a case evolves and develops, the more fascinating and kind of frightening it got. So I really, really enjoyed that, and I've run it, a few times myself, developing it, and it went really, really well. The people, players are very creeped out by it, and there's a lot going on there that.
Yeah, it has like an almost Resident Evil type feel to it. Just
Yeah.
the whole synopsis sounds like something straight out of a Resident Evil game.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a big challenge to kind of rein things in. Even when your agents are not Delta Green agents, they're just CDC people. Their priority is still minimizing harm, and it's keeping the outbreak from breaking out any further. And that by itself is a really tough challenge, and the repercussions of doing it poorly are brutal.
Are there any plans to come up with another release like Control Group, where it's introductory scenarios, or like a package like that for new players?
Not that I can think of. The thing that's made Delta Green that's made Delta Green succeed all these years is that it's really not that hard to latch onto it. Once the players kind of get the core concept of, we have to keep this under wraps, or at least we've been told, by our case officers, that we have to do everything in our power to keep this under wraps, and it's worth paying any price to keep anyone else from being exposed to this, whatever the threat is. Once they kind of buy that core concept, everything else kind of spins out really naturally. And so any of the scenarios that we've published, you can put it in front of brand new players, and once they kind of get that idea, then they can run with it. The only exception I would say is like one of the there was a series that Dennis wrote a long time ago called Future Perfect, which was a 4-part series, and so the last of those is by definition a sequel to the other 3. So you wouldn't want to run that as your first one, but even then, any of those other 3 you could run as the first adventure for brand new players, and they would glom onto it easily.
What other Mythos games have you been exposed to? And what are some of the aspects of those games that you like?
Let's see. So of course we've I've played Trail of Cthulhu and Night's Black Agents by Pelgrane, and the in Trail the core idea in Trail of Cthulhu is to kind of de-randomize a lot of the aspects of investigation, and to so that the idea behind it is if your players come up with a course of investigation, then the challenge ought to be what resources can they bring to bear, and not just the luck of the dice as to whether they happen to find the clue that moves them forward into the next part of the mystery. And that was that was a really useful insight, I think, because there have been a lot of Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green adventures over the years where you can pick out little moments where everything going forward hinges on the characters making a skill roll, and that's sort of your default when you're writing these things is, okay, now to do this they should make a history roll or whatever. And so we took, that I very deliberately lifted or sort of took part of that concept and put it in Delta Green and explicitly said in the core rules that, if you're investigating something and it's not a weird crisis and it shouldn't feel like crazy things can happen, then then what matters is how much skill do you have, not whether you actually succeed at rolling the dice properly. But yeah, and so I mean, I tend to pay attention to a lot of the games. I've played Tremulous a few times, and I think hold on, I lose track anyway. But anyway, there's Silent Legions is one that came out a few years ago by Kevin Crawford, who does brilliant work in the old school Renaissance things, and so Silent Legions is sort of his Lovecraftian horror thing. And what Kevin is great at is just giant tables of random things that you can use to generate stuff at the table without a lot of planning, and you can just sort of tie them together. And he does a great job in Silent Legions of making that process, picking and choosing the things that go in those tables and the way that they can be tied together, right, to make them really evocative. I'm a huge fan of. I was a huge fan of Over the Edge from way back when, which isn't a Lovecraftian game. It's surreal. It's about surrealism, but it's just and the new edition as well. It was like an eye opening experience to read that game back in the old days. And see, wow, this is really, really different and new. We sort of get so accustomed to the niches in role-playing games. We play Dungeons and Dragons, and what's it like? Well, it's like Dungeons and Dragons, and the idea that there's so much more out there in fiction and literature and TV, so many different kinds of experience that you can bring to the table is sometimes revelatory.
Do you ever find yourself, when you play games, since you're a designer, do you ever find yourself overanalyzing certain mechanics? Like, oh, I could have done this, I would have done this differently, or this
Sure.
mechanic could have been.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, inevitably, there's no choice. I mean, you have to, you basically have to kind of, or at least I do. I have to kind of force myself to just, rein that in and because otherwise I could drive myself crazy. So we just did a reprint of the Agent's Handbook to go with a new batch of the slipcase sets of the core rules that are going to be shipping next month, and while that was at the printer, there was a tweak on one of the rules for disorders that came to me that I felt like would really streamline things, and would play a lot better. And so I was like, hey, I got this idea. Why don't we do this? And we could switch that page out, and Dennis has to be the sane one in these moments and say, you know what, let's wait. We'll do a second edition in a couple of years, whatever, 5 years, however long it takes. Let's play test something before we just change the page of the rules.
Speaking of seeing something recently from the printers, you had, I think it was on your Twitter, you had shown a advanced copy of the annotated version of The King in Yellow that you guys are publishing.
Mm-hmm.
This book clearly looks like a passion project from everyone involved.
It's so awesome.
Yeah, Sam's art is incredible, and Ken's Height's annotations are really insight's what made you want to take on this project and do this?
It was, I think, I don't remember where the idea came from first. I think it might have come from Ken first, where he was talking to me or was talking to Dennis or both of us at some point, and of course we all love Robert Chambers' work, and Chambers' contribution to horror is kind of fascinating in its own right because it's so limited, and yet has had such an impact. I mean, it's when you're talking about the Yellow Sign and the King in Yellow and Carcosa, all of that came from maybe 3-4 short stories that he wrote, and and yet it was so evocative that it just had this enormous impact on us all these years later. Once it started getting folded into the Cthulhu mythos and kind of, squished in with the rest of it. So yeah, I think it was probably his idea way back when. This is a few years ago, saying it would be really interesting to do annotations for that and to do the research and really dig in, And we both said, "Oh yeah, that sounds great. We would love to see that." And and Ken's the one to do it. I mean, to do that kind of work for us, it's either. I mean, I don't have the patience to do all that, right? Yeah. That would either be Ken Hyde or Jess Nevins, and and Ken had the idea. So yeah, and then we were talking to Sam, and Sam Mariah had done artwork for us in a few projects before, so we're old friends, and he started doing some he was doing some paintings about that were inspired by the King in Yellow stories and mythology and the way that mythology has evolved, and that were heavily informed by like alchemy and sort of hermeticism, and so we were so that all just sort of came together just by dint of us talking with them, and and we kind of it was apparent really early that we could bring together Sam's gorgeous paintings that he was developing and Ken's research and create something that we would love to have on our shelves.
Oh yeah, it looks incredible.
Yeah.
But you and Ken have worked on other projects as well, correct? Ken came out with the Fall of Delta Green. I believe that was in April of last year.
Yeah. Ken Hite. So Ken Hite has we've worked with Ken on lots of different things. He wrote part of for my money probably the best part of Wild Talents, which is a superhero role playing game that we did years ago, and he wrote a good chunk of a thing called the Cult of Transcendence, which was a big chapter, this big sort of sprawling conspiracy that you can use in your Delta Green games if you want. It was featured in Targets of Opportunity, and he wrote Trail of Cthulhu for Pelgrane Press and Night's Black Agents for Pelgrane Press, so we'd worked with him many things, and he contributed actively to Delta Green, the role playing game. So a lot of the basically every page in that book is kind of a hodgepodge of different authors, because it always starts with one author and then mostly Dennis and me, but the rest of us kind of put our fingers in until we're happy with it. So a lot of the material on the supernatural and the Cthulhu mythos itself and the background of it, Ken did the initial writing for those. And yeah, so the fall of Delta Green came about because we'd been working with him already, and he was working with Pelgrane so much, and Pelgrane said they would love to do something with Delta Green using their Gumshoe rules engine, and that's how that came together. Yeah.
Neat mentioned passion projects a little bit earlier, and a couple of years ago when you were still working on Wrestlenomicon, I heard about another passion project that involved Delta Green, but as a card game. It's called Zero Sum. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, that was so. Zero Sum is a game that Dennis and I were batting around. I think he had the original concept of it a few years ago. It hasn't really gone anywhere lately because we've been so busy getting everything else out the door. But the idea of it is that when you're playing the game, it's kind of a cooperative game, but each of the players has cards that represent some piece of the Delta Green conspiracy, and each card is like an asset or a resource or an event that you can bring together. But as you're playing, every turn there's there's a threat card that has to come out, right, or a weird development or a complication or something. And so every turn, you're sort of racing to, each threat that let me say the core of it was that to neutralize a threat, like you play a threat card and that card goes on the table, and you have to deal with that card by deploying assets to it, and the asset cards connect with each other, and you want to actually make a loop, right? You start from the threat, and then you apply one asset, another asset, and if you can apply enough assets that they can connect together in a way to make a loop around connecting back to the threat, then that seals off the threat, and it's no longer a threat to deal with. But your challenge is that there are, the threats can kind of pile up if you're not really, really quick and lucky. And so each player has access to these assets and resources and things that you can do. But yeah, so it was going to be all about the kind of race against the explosion of the unnatural into the world, and the more of these threats that pile up without being addressed, the likelier you are to just lose the game altogether. That was the idea behind it. Yeah. But it sounded like a really fun idea. So we hope we can come back to it and develop it a little further soon.
We definitely hope so.
Yeah, we definitely
sounds
do.
Fun. Yeah.
Yeah, it has similar it harkens similar beats to Arkham Horror, the card game too, which has you investigating
cooperative
various locations. Yeah. It's cooperative. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it harkens very similar beats. So
it could be. Yeah. I think Zero Sum was the way we had been thinking about it was sort of bigger picture, so it's like we're going to send, one of your cards might be like this team of investigators, right, or SEAL Team 9 or whatever.
Okay.
That you can basically throw at a threat, and so it was the idea behind it was to be kind of strategic and about the growing dread of seeing these things happen from sort of the big picture level.
How far in did you guys get into the development of it?
Oh, I mean, pretty much what I've just told you.
Just tossing ideas around.
Yeah. We didn't get really deeply into it, because like I said, we were at the same time we were trying to bring Wrestlenomicon together. We spent a long time Dennis and I spent a long time trying to bat the mechanics of Wrestlenomicon around between ourselves before before we had the most brilliant idea of all, which was to hire somebody who was good at it to do that.
Wrestlenomicon sounds like a lot of fun. I think that's that game. Maybe we'll do a spotlight for it on one of the episodes. When is it releasing again?
It'll be in the fall. I don't have a firm month. I expect that's going to be, what is it, June now? So July. Yeah, I would expect probably October is when we'll have the boxes in the warehouse and shipping out to backers and to stores. But as always with scheduling for Arc Dream, don't hold me to that.
Well, speaking of soon-to-be released products, you had mentioned that you're lucky now to essentially get one issue of the Unspeakable Oath done a year. Can you give us any details on issue 26?
Yes.
Oh yeah, no, I don't even have any details on it. Well, the big hold up with the new issue of the Oath is that I decided a long time ago that when 25 was still coming together, that I mean, doing a magazine for gaming, especially for such a tight niche, as the Oath is always really challenging. And so, so I decided a while ago that what we need to do with the rise of Patreon and over the last several years was switch the Oath subscription model to just a Patreon, patron model. And but I need to, I'm it's kind of been in the top 3 of my to-do list for months and months and months to put that Patreon site together, and bring together all of the people that can start, that can start contributing.
It's work.
Right. So,
and once you roll out a Patreon, you're kind of committed at that point.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So that's kind of that's sort of where it is right now. Is I'm gonna bring that together and put it online, and then we'll sort of see what the response is, right? And if the response is really great, then we'll essentially what that'll mean is we'll do a lot more writing on it a lot more quickly and put the issues out pretty swiftly, and then we'll see what the pacing looks like.
Shane, before we wrap things up here, where can people find you if they want to check out all the stuff that we talked about today?
Sure. So arcstream.com is ARCDREAM.com is our main company website. Delta Green has its own website at deltagreen.com. We're on Twitter at ArcDream LLC and Delta Green RPG, and those are the big places. I think we have a couple of Instagram accounts that we post a lot of preview shots on and stuff like that.
Well, that's great. Shane, we want to thank you very much for coming onto the cast and taking your time to speak with us about Delta Green and other Mythos games.
It was really awesome picking your brain. It was a lot of fun.
My pleasure.
Any plans on ever attending the Portland H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival?
Oh, I would love to. I don't have concrete plans, but I mean, I'm in Alabama, so it's kind of a trek. But Scott Glancy, who runs Pagan Publishing and is
been there every year.
Oh yeah, with Delta Green is there every year, and we have other friends, that I mean Gwen and Brian Callahan are principals involved in that, and we've been friends with them forever and ever, and I would love to. If my family is likely to be moving up to the Pacific Northwest in a couple of years, so once we're up there, it's going to be way more accessible, I expect. Mm-hmm.
If you do, I'd love to meet you in person.
Sure, yeah, that would be great.
Are there any other conventions or festivals that you are going to be attending, Shane, that people can check you out at, or?
So we're at Gen Con every year. We have have a couple of booths at Gen Con this year, and usually pretty much the whole team is at Gen Con every year, and I'll be at Scott and I and my wife Rachel, who helps run things kind of behind the scenes on at Arc Dream, are going to be at Necronomicon Providence this year.
Oh, very cool.
So
I might be going to that, so maybe I'll see you there, Shane.
Yeah, that'd be great. But yeah, I went there. Oh gosh, I went there in 2013. I haven't been back since then. But yeah, so I mean, Ken's going to be there, and Scott's going to be there, and of course there are lots of authors that we like, and the Cody Goodfellow, I'm sure, is going to be there. Laird Barron. There's lots of folks that whose work we love. It's fun to sort of see people in person.
Nice. Very nice. Well, is there anything you want to say to our audience before we close things out, Shane? Or
yeah, just check out Delta Green if you haven't already, and see what it's really like. It's kind of funny because there's I was speaking to a Call of Cthulhu player, a fellow Call of Cthulhu player, a month or two ago, who and I said, that I was working on Delta Green, and he said he'd always been really curious about it, but what he'd heard was that Delta Green was this game where you're all playing soldiers and it's in the modern day, and so he felt like there just wasn't going to be enough of a sense of suspense and desperation, for it, and I thought that was, on the one hand, I thought that was kind of hilarious because the game is nothing but suspense and desperation, and the more guns you bring to it, the worse it gets. But at the same time, that was kind of a fascinating thing to hear. So anybody else that's heard that about it, you should check it out. There's the quick start book is called Need to Know, and you can get the PDF of that for free. And basically we wrote that so if you read the first couple of pages of Need to Know, you'll have a sense pretty quickly if Delta Green is going to be for you.
They can get it free on the Arc Dream Publishing website.
Oh yeah. If you just Google Delta Green Need to Know, you can download it from like Drive-Thru RPG or whatever. But it's
perfect.
But the PDF is totally free.
Sweet. Well, thank you very much.
All right, it's been fun. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Shane.
Thanks, Shane.
All right.
Alrighty, and with that, we're going to close out today's episode. This has been Nate, Lost in Time and Space.
And Innkeeper Vase Odin from Twisted Tentacle Inn.
And our special guest,
Shane Ivey.
Alrighty.
Just plain Shane Ivey this time.
Alrighty, thanks you guys so much for listening.